Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Conway Hall in quarantine for month number, I've completely lost count. It's been a long lockdown. I hope you're well. Welcome to Conway Hall's regular Sunday talks called Thinking on Sunday. We've been doing Thinking on Sunday for a few years now, but this follows a long tradition of Sunday talks on ethics and thought and how to make the world a better place that Conway Hall has been doing since before Conway Hall was built in 1929. If you're not familiar with Conway Hall, welcome for the first time. We are a charity essentially established to promote ethical thought. So putting on talks like this is part of our charitable mission. How it will go this evening is this afternoon. Sorry. George will speak for about half an hour after this clunky introduction. Then we will give you the opportunity to ask questions. Best way to do questions is you'll see at the bottom Zoom has a little question and answer box. Type your question in there, and then we can give you the opportunity to speak through a microphone. We can unmute you, so you can ask your question directly. We will not be turning cameras on for anyone, don't worry. Or if you say, please, I don't want to read it out, I don't have a microphone, let us know and we'll read it out at this end. And that's how we'll do the Q&A. If you're of a tweeting persuasion, our hashtag is Thinking on Sunday. If you want to tweet about this on that Twitter. And I think that's everything. So with a really timely talk on voting, intelligent machines, possibly unintelligent humans, I'm not sure. I'm really happy to introduce George Zarkadakis. We practice that. George is a writer of science. George is a writer and science communicator and artificial intelligence engineer. He's also a digital innovation professional. That was all before lunchtime. Now speaking on his book, The Digital Revolution, and how learning machines can help in elections. Please do welcome George Zarkadakis.
Thank you very much, Scott, and hi everybody. Thank you very much for finding time on a Sunday to join my talk. I'd like to present some ideas that are in my new book called Cyber Republic, just published by MIT Press. So I'm going to spend, as Scott suggested, about 30 minutes discussing those ideas at the intersection between technology and politics, and then I'll open up to discussion, handing over to Scott to facilitate. So let me first of all share my screen. So let me start with the word democracy. So if you think that you're citizens living in a democracy, you are mistaken. You, I, are citizens in a constitutional republic or monarchy, as is the case in the United Kingdom and several other European countries. The constitutional republics or monarchies that we live in have a form of government called liberal democracy. It's the word democracy that confuses us. So let's say for now that the word is meaningful only on specific dates in an electoral cycle, once every 4 years or so, when we are allowed to exercise our right to hold free elections and decide who will rule us until the next election. Between elections, we do not have a democracy. Why? Because the word democracy means the rule of the people, and clearly it is not the people that rule, but our representatives, the government we put in place with a vote. In his book, The Social Contract, Jean-Jacques Rousseau summarizes this important point thus: the people of England regard itself as free, but it is grossly mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of parliament. As soon as they are elected, slavery overtakes it and is nothing. I profoundly agree with Rousseau's observation, albeit without his dramatic overtones. Nevertheless, let me also say that I'm a huge fan of constitutional republics and liberal democracies, and for the rest of my talk, I'll try to defend them to the best of my ability and suggest ways to improve them. But before doing so, let me explain why I feel this way. It is all about rights. Liberalism, the philosophy that came out of the European Enlightenment during the 17th and 18th centuries, invented the concept of natural rights, which means rights that each and every one of us has by virtue of being born a human. This was quite revolutionary at the time. It is also an idea in direct conflict with democracy. You see, in a real democracy, where the people rule the society by majority voting, the many can vote to revoke certain rights from the minority. We saw this clearly in the Brexit referendum, where the 52% decided to diminish the rights of the 48%. And I mean their rights as EU citizens, such as to freely travel and work across the European Union, appeal to the European Court of Justice, etc. In very much the same way, in a real democracy, an impoverished majority may vote to confiscate the property of the wealthy few or take away rights from minorities whose color or religion are different from the majorities, or from those who are not tall enough or healthy enough or do not exercise often. You see where I'm going with this. Totalitarian regimes and authoritarians are all about real democracy. People rule and all that. There's a lot of excitement in the beginning, and flags flying and crowds cheering, until things go quickly south and one ends up in a concentration camp or a gulag or a killing field or a poverty line. And that is why I have decided to defend constitutional republics. They protect human rights through the rule of law, parliaments, courts of justice, checks and balances, and the free press, but they do so at the expense of real democracy. Now, this existential and paradoxical tension between rights and democracy is at the heart of the persisting political crisis that we have been witnessing since the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. Publics are no longer trusting constitutional republics governed as liberal democracies. As a result, publics are susceptible to the sirens of populism, which means to the message of politicians or political parties or movements that prioritize the will of majorities over the rights of minorities. So publics give their vote to those who will ultimately take away their rights. We have seen this phenomenon before in the early 20th century. The evils of Nazism, fascism, and communism, and the ghosts of the tens of millions of victims are a cautionary tale of what can go wrong when public discontent is ignored. But what exactly is it that we are not trusting about our political system? I would argue there are at least two principal areas of public mistrust and fear. Firstly, mistrust in the institutions and workings of liberal democracy. This mistrust is fueled by AI algorithms that polarize public opinion, as well as AI systems used by private organizations and governments to spy on our private lives. Secondly, there is genuine fear for the future, especially because of the impact of automation technologies, such as robots, big data and AI, on work and livelihoods. So let me therefore explore those two areas in turn, examine how intelligent machines are implicated, and suggest ways to repurpose technology in order to evolve or upgrade, if you prefer, our system of government. Now, political representation is the key decision-making mechanism of liberal democracy, and it suffers from the so-called principal-agent problem. Now, we the citizens are the principals, and the politicians that we vote for are our agents, in the sense that we trust them with running the country on our behalf and in our name. The problem is that the politicians' interests do not always align with ours. Politicians in a liberal democracy are a professional class that needs to keep their jobs, i.e. to get re-elected. One might say that all they need to do is represent us well, do our bidding, look after our interests, and we'll happily reward them with our vote come next election. Reality, however, has a way to clash with political theory and good intentions. In the case of liberal democracies, reality is influenced by money. What I mean by that is that powerful minorities with special interests and deep pockets can exert disproportional influence on the political process and policy outcomes, such as legislation, regulation, international trade, foreign policy, etc. Simply put, money buys power and politicians through lobbying and quite often through straightforward bribery. By way of hard evidence, a study by Princeton and Northwestern universities shifted through 1,800 US policies enacted between 1981 and 2002 and compared them to the expressed preferences of average Americans, 50th percentile of income, affluent Americans, 90th percentile, and large special interest groups. The researchers concluded that the US is dominated by its economic elite. As stated in the research report, when a minority of citizens disagrees with economic elites and or economic interests, they generally lose. Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built in the US political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor political change, they generally do not get it. That's the swamp Trump referred to so successfully in 2016 when he won the presidency. In any case, for large swathes of people in Western democracies, evidence and data are unnecessary for what they already instinctively know, that the political game is rigged and stacked firmly against them. That elites, a word meaning anyone except them, are conspiring while lining their pockets in the process, hence the mistrust. Enter now AI algorithms in social media that act as self-confirming megaphones for biased opinions or downright crazy conspiracy theories, and what you get is the death of facts and the obliteration of listening. But we need facts, and we need to listen to each other, especially when we disagree. We need facts and civil dialogue desperately if liberal democracies are to survive in the 21st century. So what can we do? My suggestion is that we need an injection of real democracy in liberal democracies in the form of consultative citizen assemblies. So here's how this works. You pick a group of citizens by sortition. The composition of the group should reflect the demographics of the wider society to which the group belongs in terms of age, gender, race, religion, etc. Then this representative group of citizens, the assembly, is given a subject to deliberate and deliver an opinion, a point of view. For example, a constitutional citizen assembly that was set up in Ireland in 2016 to deliberate on changing the abortion law. Over a period of 5 weekends, 99 complete strangers, an assemblage of students, housewives, and truck drivers with views ranging from pro-life to pro-choice to undecided, paved the way to the national referendum that took place in 2018. The citizens' deliberations were broadcast on the internet. They discussed abortion with legal, ethics, and medical experts and listened to testimonies by women who faced crisis pregnancies and had to get an abortion outside Ireland. At the end of the deliberation process, the majority of citizens recommended to amend the constitution. Indeed, 2/3 of the assembly suggested legalizing abortion without any restrictions. The view and decision of the Citizen Assembly reflected the national vote in the Irish referendum of 2018. Thus, the Irish Citizen Assembly helped to achieve broad national consensus on a highly polarizing subject. Citizen assemblies are already being used across the world with great success and in many countries. They have helped to tackling difficult decisions on a number of issues, ranging from urban planning and health to managing the environment, public spending, and institutional setup, as was the case in Ireland. I would like to see citizen assemblies becoming a new liberal institution that works in tandem with parliaments and the executive. By including citizens in the formation of legislation and policy, we can dispel much of the mistrust that currently plagues our system of government. I often wonder how much better liberal democracies would have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic if citizens were also consulted on what measures should be taken and were included in the deliberation of the possible outcomes from the various strategies and options. The top-down imposition of lockdowns and the curtail of civil liberties that polarized public opinion have fueled the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories. As a result, a recent survey by Pew revealed that 49% of Americans would rather not vaccinate themselves against COVID, and similar percentages exist across Europe. You may, of course, argue that public health is something for the experts to decide, the epidemiologists, the medical doctors, the statisticians, the scientists, and that non-experts, who are most of us, should just sit quiet and trust the experts to guide us out of this mess. But this is not the case. Science can tell you what would be the outcome if you decided A instead of B. But deciding between A and B is always a political choice, a moral choice. Politics are indispensable in human affairs and instrumental in resolving the constant dilemmas that we are faced with. Clearly, given all this evidence, we can no longer leave politics to the professional politicians alone. Citizen assemblies are therefore a step towards making liberal democracies more transparent, inclusive, trustworthy, and yes, more democratic as well. However, if we are to scale up the use of citizen assemblies and embed them as a new institution of government at local, national, and international level, we need technology to make the sortition process simple and the work of the citizen assembly easy, especially when citizens deliberate on complex issues that require specialist knowledge. Artificial intelligence systems, such as a new generation of conversational agents, can help bridge the knowledge gap between experts and non-experts and inform the deliberation of citizens on any subject, however complex it might be. In my book, Citizen Cyber Republic, I have a detailed description of how this new kind of AI could work in a citizen assembly, but let me summarize here the key points. Today, the best algorithms we have are at the service of global advertising colossuses. As such, their goal is to personalize content around our biases and vices. Hence, the negative implications of AI in fueling political polarization. But we could repurpose AI and develop a different set of algorithms that help us understand an issue, check the validity of information before pushing it to our consumption, expose us to opposing views, sensitize us to the various decision costs, and help us develop a new level of civic consciousness, one that compels us to prioritize the well-being of the whole and encourages towards consensus. Let me now switch to the second reason that publics mistrust liberal democracies, which is fear about their economic future and prosperity. This fear is strongly linked to the future of work and how the combined forces of free markets and automation technologies are eroding the balance of power between capital and labor and replace labor, white and blue-collar workers alike, with intelligent machines. The so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution is upon us, and many people, in fact, most people, worry that robots may take away their jobs and the jobs of their children and grandchildren. Now let's take a look at the concept of work. Work has been the bedrock of social and economic mobility since the first industrial revolution some 200 years ago. It is through work that globalization managed to raise the living standards of billions in the late 20th century and dramatically reduce poverty across our planet. Work has greatly benefited from technology. Since the first industrial revolution, technologies such as steam engines, electricity, trains and airplanes, computers and telecommunication networks have increased human productivity and create the phenomenon of economic growth, something that was inconceivable in all the previous eras of human history. Machines have extracted humanity from the so-called Malthusian trap, where humans living in an agrarian society are bound by the limits of their low productivity. Machines are physical and cognitive multipliers that augment our productivity and enable us to create surplus that can support a larger human population, which can then produce more surplus, and so on. Therefore, machines are the key to transitioning from an economy of scarcity to an economy of abundance. Machines are also disruptors of traditional business models, and some technologies, called general purpose technologies, and artificial intelligence is one of them, can dramatically change the whole of the economy by creating new industries while destroying others in a relatively short period of time. In 1901, there were 3.25 million horses in England, ploughing fields, hauling wagons and carriages, pulling boats on the canals, toiling the pits, and carrying armies into battle. The advent and democratization of cars in the following decades changed this century-old use of horses completely. Gone were the professions that supported an economy of horses, and in came jobs such as petrol station manager, auto mechanic and car dealer, and of course petrol stations, car manufacturers, the list goes on. Economists describe two complementary effects in times of major technological disruption. The displacement effect, meaning jobs eliminated because of the technology, and the compensation effect, jobs created. So why should it be any different now with AI and robots? Shouldn't we expect the same two effects to come into play and have new jobs created in the future, better jobs, paying better money? Of course, there will be such new jobs. We already see in the creation of high-value roles such as data scientists and AI specialists. But I think the better question we must ask is how many of those new jobs will be created and how evenly distributed will be in the population. In other words, how will the enormous economic bounty of the fourth industrial revolution will be shared, and if there will be a stake in the emerging AI and data economy for all of us? The evidence so far has been that most of the wealth created by technology and globalization has gone to the hands of a tiny minority. Moreover, we are currently witnessing the platforming of work and the rise of the gig economy across all professions. So the future of work may not be the complete elimination of employment due to automation, but it is very likely to be a future where work is uncertain, intermittent, and not well paid. A dystopian view of the future and the fourth industrial revolution will be massive unemployment and underemployment, together with an ever-increasing income inequality. We witnessed a prelude of this dystopia during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, and the story is likely to repeat itself after the end of the pandemic and the lifting of government subsidies and furlough schemes. It is extremely doubtful that liberal democracies will survive the repercussions of a broken social contract. So what can we do about it? Maybe we should rethink what work means for society. Rethink work not as the main source of the necessary income to support our living, but as a source of creativity and happiness. One idea to transition to this more utopian future is that of universal basic income, whereby a minimum income is given to every citizen regardless of any other income they may have. UBI, as universal basic income is called for short, can reduce the anxiety of uncertain work and provide a cushion to absorb troughs between jobs or contracts. If meaningful, UBI could potentially free humanity from the toil and sweat of working for a living and usher us in a new age of economic abundance, a new human civilization. But where will the money come from? I hear many of you asking. Let's examine the only real example we currently have in the world of a UBI, which is the Alaskan Permanent Fund, that pays an annual amount between $1,000 and $2,000 to every permanent resident in Alaska. The money comes from the oil and gas that Alaska has. So if you have a common valuable resource, then you can find the money to finance UBI. If you do not, then UBI needs to be funded through the only other two means that the government has to raise money, that is taxes and borrowing. In a future without work, where the vast majority of citizens do not have significant income to tax, the government will have to tax big corporations and try to balance its books through borrowing, which means that big corporations will have an even greater influence over government since they are footing the tax bill and citizens are getting deeper into debt. For me, This scenario, where the government is virtually or literally privatized, is indistinguishable from feudalism. Citizens will become the serfs of the big corporates, who will be paying us pittance through a meager UBI, just enough of us to get by. I do not see such a scenario being sustainable. Sooner or later, it will lead to a revolution. The yellow vests will be back. So it seems to me that the only way we can fund UBI and sustain our liberal system of government is to find some valuable resource, an asset, that belongs to everyone, and use that asset to fund a meaningful UBI. But what could that asset be? Let's quickly look at how the global economy has been transforming over the past few decades and focus on the nature of assets, and in particular the difference between tangible assets, such as the oil and gas in Alaska, versus intangible assets, think knowledge, intellectual property, data, algorithms, software. We can clearly see the trend from tangible to intangible assets. The AI economy of the 21st century will be based on data, our data. So what if we transformed our collective data into a national or a regional or a city asset? Imagine, for example, data from sensors in a smart city collected by an organization that represents and is governed by the citizens of that city and their elected representatives. Call this organization a data trust. The data trust can then give access to that data to any private organization that desires the use of that data in order to develop algorithms, products, and services for a fee. Those fees are collected and are distributed to the citizens as dividends, as UBI. Data are indeed the new oil, but unlike oil, they are an inexhaustible resource whose value increases exponentially when combined with other data. Take, for example, a data set of patient data and combine it with a genetics data set. The combined value is far greater from the separate values of its data set because in their combination, one can gain greater insights into human health. And just to put a dollar value into that, recently, American Airlines put up as collateral in order to tap to a US government loan their loyalty program, a data set that was valued at $30 billion. Given that there are 67 million members in that program, about the same as the population of the UK, if that data set was administered by a citizen data trust, each member, each citizen, would have a share of $450,000. If we assume a 2% net annual interest on these assets, each member would receive an income of around $9,000 a year. And that's just the valuation of one data set. A smart city data trust could hold dozens of data sets, such as health records, transportation habits, street pollution levels, images, etc. By monetizing our data through democratically governed data trusts, citizens in liberal democracies can retain their political power, become key stakeholders in the AI economy, and reduce economic inequality without the need of coercive wealth redistribution. Ladies and gentlemen, today I try to explain why I'm at the same time concerned as well as hopeful about the future of liberal democracy. Concerned because of the perfect storm that is set upon us from increasing work automation, enormous economic inequality, public mistrust, fear about the future, and political polarization that so readily explodes into violence. Hopeful, because there are ways to rethink data and AI technologies, so we introduce more direct citizen participation in policymaking through citizen assemblies and upgrade democracy, as well as monetize our collective data to fund a more creative and happy life. History is at a crossroads. I think we all feel this way. The economic crisis of 2008-2009 set in motion forces that are changing our world in dramatic ways at national as well as international level. Those forces are eroding alliances that have kept peace and security since World War II, unleash revisionist forces in Asia and Europe, challenge our liberal system of government, awaken dormant voices from the extremes of the political spectrum that call for a greater role for the state, while ignoring the perils to freedom that comes from such a slippery road towards authoritarianism and oppression. But there is hope. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the transition into the AI economy, which includes the delivery of positive social and environmental outcomes and the rethinking of corporate governance. I personally would like to also see the institution of data property rights and the repurposing of AI so that its goals align with the goals of humanity, so it becomes less autonomous and more integrated into human society. The technological means that we have at our disposal in order to create a better future are enormous, and so is their potential for positive change. But will that future happen? The fact that technologies are available to us to build a better future does not in itself guarantee a better future. The single most important driver of societal change is ideology, the web of dominant ideas that a society refers to when thinking through its challenging and seeking solutions. As we face a new era in geopolitics and in the economy, we must move beyond the 20th century dipoles of left versus right and conservatives versus progressives. We need to explore radical new ideas and create new political syntheses and juxtapositions. Rage, so common nowadays, must be replaced by reason. Tribalism must give way to a new sense of patriotism, and by that I mean the feeling of belonging to a larger social group that shares a land, a history, and a set of traditions. A group that includes people with whom we may disagree, that look different to us, worship different gods or none, and yet we choose, because of our shared patriotism, to prioritize the benefit of everyone over our own. As citizens, we must believe that knowledge is possible and that we can know, however imperfectly, and that to know is better than to not know. This is very important to highlight, as truths, facts, and knowledge are under a constant barrage of algorithmic and philosophical denial. Democracy needs objective knowledge and falsifiable truths in order to function and survive. And that is what distinguishes it from totalitarianism that thrives on myths, lies, and philosophical relativism. We need philosophers, economists, political scientists, engineers, mathematicians, historians, social scientists, and every citizen, every one of us, to contribute in developing the new politics for the age of intelligent machines. A new set of ideas for rebalancing the relationship between the individual and society, for thinking in terms of networks rather than units, of collaboration as well as competition, of the economic value of social capital and not only of the capital in the bank, of digital platforms whose business models distribute dividends to those who add value through their data, participation, and interactions, rather than today's models that exploit our data and personal networks to create and funnel enormous profits to the few. Of free markets, where the incentive to take risks is only strengthened by the incentive to do good. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, George. That was fascinating. If you do have a question or comment for George, please use the chat function or raise your hand. That's an option in the attendee section. We did have one comment in the chat during your talk, George, and I hope Miss Grant doesn't mind me reading this out, that when you were discussing the referendums in Ireland, it said these Irish citizen assemblies, which is an idea that's been talked about in Thinking on Sunday before, have also brought in self-identification of gender, which came in with same-sex marriage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Apologies for the omission. They discussed a number of highly polarizing issues that were included in the referendum, including same-sex marriage. Yes. Brilliant
stuff. I mean, it's something we really missed out here when we had our referendums. I think we was left at the mercy of press barons and the like. So I really like your image of like a new way of thinking, a new, a new way of just reimagining the world. I think we know that people sort of need, be it political or religious or whatever, something to base that on. Do you think there would need to be like a unified theory beneath that, like humanism or something like that?
I much prefer when people have different opinions rather than have, are of the same opinion. You have dialogue, and that's the difference between democracy, I guess, and authoritarianism, where in authoritarianism we have the imposition of a uniform ideology, while in a democracy we have different voices. And I think that the foundations of Western civilization have been based on dialogue, and it was through dialogue that we had this amazing flourishing of ideas and technology and innovation. And if we lose that, I think we'll be at a loss. But what I try to suggest, however, is that we really need a new playbook. So we need to evolve our thinking, because it's different now because of technology, and the opportunities are different, and the risks are higher on society. So for that reason, I think that we should evolve our thinking and our political thinking. So, but that doesn't mean that we should have a uniform ideas about the future.
I mean, absolutely. It's a tricky thing to think. It's like you described as sort of a new version of nationalism to sort of unify people, because we need to be everyone to be working towards the same goal. We do have a question here from Daniel Dixon, which I'm going to read out. So Daniel says, "It seems to me that the biggest threat to our democracy is the rise in misinformation or fake news. It has sowed the seeds of discontent and division in the heart of our society and destroyed public discourse and our capacity for tolerance, which was the glue that held our democracy together. How do we tackle this issue without infringing on people's right to free speech?" So how do we?
Yes, of course, yeah. So, in the beginning, when sort of social media came online, there was a lot of excitement because, for many people, especially social scientists and others, they looked into social media as a new platform for democracy, right? So it would be like, democracy on steroids. People will have, will speak their voice. We'll have a huge agora, right? But what happened was, what we know now, this agora did not happen. What we ended up having is this sort of highly polarized world, to the point that the member just mentioned, fake news. What led us to this end is the way social media platforms are functioning, right? So it's the mechanisms and what's under the hood of social media functioning. So under the hood is a business model. These social media platforms are businesses. They're not public fora. So as businesses, they need to make money. And the model that they have, the business model they have, is an advertising model, meaning that the algorithms that they use in order to orchestrate the conversation between people do not have a different goal than the goals of democracy. So in the democracy, the goal is to have some kind of consensus, some kind of understanding, some kind of compromise. But that compromise would not work for an advertising model. So the advertising model works when people are feeling very passionate about that and they keep engaging with something. So that is why we have ended up here. Now, what choices do we have? Do we want, for example, to break Facebook up? Do we want to, ask Facebook to change the business model? There's a lot of ideas we can have, and I don't know how feasible that might be. But what I'm suggesting, and that is what I'm suggesting in my talk and in my book, is to think of other ways where we can incentivize entrepreneurs and technologies to develop platforms where we have algorithms that do the opposite from what the algorithms that social media currently do. So instead of, for example, personalizing content around our biases, okay, and making sure we just, confirm through this content the fact that we're right and everybody else is wrong, perhaps we should have algorithms that do the exact opposite, right? Challenge our opinions and help us understand an opposing point of view, which is extremely difficult. And that is why, again, I'm referring back to the point I made before, that is why we need to really think hard how we leverage technology in order to get those outcomes, right?
Okay, we've got a couple of questions in. I'm going to, Callum, can I see if we can open your microphone, if that's okay? Because otherwise it's just my voice, and who wants to hear that? Hi, Callum.
Do you hear this?
You can.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for the talk, George. I was wondering, how would you respond to people who don't want their data to be stored, or don't want it to be shared with particular third parties? And would there be an opportunity to opt out of particular elements of it? And would you like everyone to receive the UBI regardless of how much they participate?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. My opinion is that people should have, obviously, the right to opt out. If they don't want to share the data in that data trust that just described, they must have the right to opt out. But there should be consequences for opting out. There should not be free riders, you see. So if they opt out from a data trust or from all data trusts, that should impact how much UBI, how much dividend they get. So that's my answer.
Okay, there we go. I've got a question from Charlotte here that I'm going to read out, and we'll move on to the next question. When oil was discovered in the 20th century, governments did not overtly share the proceeds with their citizens, apart from some Scandinavian countries, I think. Can we really expect current collectors of data, Facebook, Google, Amazon, to share this new data resource with the citizens? What is in it for them?
Thank you for this question. So I think if it was up to the companies, obviously they wouldn't do anything that would disturb, the business model. But as we clearly see, definitely in the European Union and in the US, there is a lot of backlash from legislators, both the European Council and the Parliament and the Congress, are looking into ways to regulate the power of those big tech companies. And one of the reasons is that, there are sort of reasons around democracy, obviously, and about rights. But there's another reason as well, which I think should be mentioned. Those behemoths, they prevent other innovators from coming up with ideas and challenge their business models. So we have a monoculture in technology, which it needs to be disturbed. It's not a playing field anymore. So to give you an answer to your question, I think that by themselves they will not, but I'm hopeful that our representatives, again, in Brussels or in Westminster or in Washington, they're about to do something about it. And they want to do something about it because there's so much pressure from all of us, right? And so hopefully it will be different now. But I think it will be a lot more different if there is also some grassroots innovation from entrepreneurs picking up those ideas and delivering those, new digital platforms that are more sort of cooperative, like all those data trusts that I mentioned. And let me finish just with that. Very recently, I think last week, the European Commission published a proposal for new regulation around data, which is all about those, they call them data intermediaries that I mentioned. I mentioned the word data trust. The European Union is using the word data intermediaries in order to try to reestablish some kind of balance of power in the data market that includes, citizen data being administered more democratically, more openly, more transparently, and in my opinion, being also used as a way to finance future living.
Okay, we're going to move to David Wood's question in a moment, which I think is quite similar to the one you've just answered, but it'd be good to expand on this a bit. But I'd like to put this to you and maybe David as well. That Ms. Grant has just come into the Q&A and asked, is the speaker really suggesting that people exchange their data for UBI, universal basic income? That seems like cyber serfdom to me. I don't know if you want to answer that, and then we'll move to David.
Cyber what? I'm sorry, what's
serfdom?
Okay. So depends who's in control, right? And depends, on your freedom to choose if you want to do that or not. So right now, the situation is that nobody asks you. Companies are harvesting your data and they're making a lot of money. So this is the status quo now. This is the situation right now. And, even if you think about, GDPR trying to ensure that there are some sort of rights around privacy, such regulation is always difficult to enforce. Okay? If you visit a website and you get all those pop-ups about cookies, most people will just, push the button just for the cookies to go away and enter the service. That means you've already given access to your data, and you have no control over that. So what I'm trying to explore is what alternatives do we have, okay, to that. And I think one alternative is to create common pool resources of data, where we, think of it as a data. You have a share, and you also have a voice. And that data cooperative then contracts access to the data by de-identifying. There's lots of technology you can use, right? Privacy can be preserved. The problem is not about privacy, by the way. Privacy has been solved, if you like. But privacy by itself does not solve the problem of how we're going to live in the future. That's what concerns me the most. And that's why I suggested this idea of data trust, whereby it's not just about privacy, but very importantly, it's about property rights. Now, I'm just going to finish with that. Usually the concept of property rights is about individual property rights, and some people think about my own data, but I think that is not the right way to think about data. It's a completely different resource. So it's a resource that acquires value when combined with other data. So that's why it's a common resource, and we need a different way of not just thinking about it, but also how we administer common pool resources. And there are economic theories out there that can help us. I can go into details, but I think that's the key points. First of all, don't think of individual data, because individual data by itself is not that valuable. In fact, it's very, there's not a lot of value to it. But aggregate data, a combination of data, that's extremely valuable.
Okay, well, David Wood's been waiting for a little while. So, David, you have a question? That's fine.
Yes, thanks first to George for such an interesting talk. I do want to ask a bit more about this idea that data held in some public hands in these trusts could be the means of paying for a universal basic income and so on. But I wonder, is the wealth of these very large companies which you listed, is it due primarily to their data, or is it due to the algorithms, their intelligence, the smart things that they uniquely can do with their data? Because I think it's more than just the data. I think if we try to somehow aggregate the data and put it into public ownership, that wouldn't be enough. And personally, I think we need to do more to take more control back from these big companies. There has to be some element of redistribution of profits from them as well. Although I am intrigued by this suggestion of the data trusts.
Oh, thank you for that, David. So yeah, absolutely. There's many ways, and there's a lot of suggestions from economists about digital tax and robot tax. So there are ways, there are instruments in the hands of governments to distribute wealth. The only reason I didn't adopt that angle in my book is, first of all, because many other people have explored it to exhaustion. Secondly, because I'm not convinced that countries can really tax those big companies effectively. I mean, it's a struggle. I mean, the European Union right now is trying to tax, and the UK actually is trying to tax Google and Facebook, and what that creates is in fact a trade war between us and the US. So it's not easy. It's not easy at all, actually. And that's where I was thinking, okay, what are the main actors, right? What are the main pieces of the puzzle of the AI economy? One is, to your point, very much, it's the algorithms, it's the software, it's the know-how, there's a lot of bright people hired by those companies as well. And there's another thing called the data, right? So the data is the resource. So in order for you, if you are Facebook or whoever you are, right, even if you're big or small or medium size, in order to compete in the AI economy, in order to develop those new services and those new products, you need a constant, continuous access to a very wide data set, which is varied, right? This is what separates right now the data-rich companies from the data-poor companies. And therefore, I suggested that because we supply data by the mere fact that we exist, right? We don't have to do anything, right? It's a completely different way of thinking of human beings. So far, we've been thinking about human beings as potential liabilities, meaning that if you're not working, you're a liability. Someone else has to feed you, right? I think data and the AI economy provides us with an opportunity to completely rethink, our economic value in society. okay, as someone who contributes by the mere fact that we exist and we interact with digital systems. And that is why I thought that, focusing on the data and understanding how we can create a new way of sharing on the wealth and the value of the data is very meaningful. Now, I'm just going to finish my answer with this. You're very right. There's other pieces of the puzzle that are also very important, right? Like you mentioned algorithms, or you mentioned, the know-how. And there are indeed, open source systems out there that, like Python and other systems that are used for AI. So there are other ways as well that we can democratize the AI economy. But for most of us who are not AI engineers, who are not, data scientists, I think data trusts, or the idea of data property rights, is one that is both feasible and it's also very promising.
Okay. Good. I see David doesn't have a response to that at the moment. That's good. We don't have any more questions in, so unless someone puts their hand up very quickly, I think we'll call it an afternoon. George, thank you very much for your talk. It was inspiring and frightening in equal measures, and that's a good thing. That's kind of what we like here.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for spending the Sunday afternoon with us. Thank you.
It's good. These online talks have been great, and but we do look forward to being back in Conway Hall as well. So thank you very much, George Zarkadakis. Thank you everyone for coming. If you're new to Conway Hall, do please check out our website. We will be doing a lot more online events and hopefully at some point in-person events in the future. Hope you'll stay well and stay safe in the meantime. So thank you very much. And thank you once again to George. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone.